India and the US has experienced a tremendous demographic transformation, namely from the baby boom stage of development, population development of the 1950s and 1960s to the present demographic dividend stage of the population development. It is projected that the current stage of development will last until around the time the Republic of Indonesia celebrates its 100 years of independence in 2045, give and take. This fundamental demographic transformation could not take place without the deliberate participation of practically all stakeholders in the country in a long period of almost 5 decades. We also have to recognize the important, may I say, strategic role of the first generation of economic technocrats in initiating this historical transformation of both the demography and the economy of Indonesia. Professor Sadli was a distinguished member of this group of technocrats working to change Indonesia in the long period of the last 4 decades of the 20th century. Among the reading public, Professor Sadli was recognized as a prolific commentator on economy and business. The Sadli lecture is a recognition of this historical feat of this group of the so-called Generasi 45. They fought in the struggle for independence of Indonesia before moving on to create the technocracy of Indonesia. We hope that the fighting spirit of this generation will be carried forward long into the next decades by the millennium generation, who will be soon taking over the national leadership in the next general election, inshallah. Please heed the statement of one of the philosophers, Martin Heidegger, that our origins are our future. Or may I use bahasa Indonesia, masa depan Anda akan menunjukkan dari mana Anda berasal. Please accept my best wishes for today's 8th Sadli lecture. Thank you very much for your kind patience and attention. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Professor, for the welcoming remarks. Now I would like to invite Mr. Budi Resosudarmo, Ph.D., as the head of FEUI Indonesia project, to give another welcoming remarks. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, first of all, on behalf of the Indonesia project, I would like to thank to all of you for coming to this event. The project also would like to say a special thanks to the Excellency, our Minister of Finance, Dr. Chatib Basri, and also to Ibu Sadli, and also a special thanks to Pak Dorodjatun. The project also would like to thank LPEM for a long-standing collaboration in conducting this Sadli lecture. The project certainly looking forward to more collaboration with LPM. And finally, the project would like to thank Australian DFAT for their support to the project, so then the project can participate in this event. And the project is very happy being able to keep doing this, because I think this is, we feel that this activity is very useful to both Indonesian scholars in Australia, and also the project, feel has a lot of respect to Pak Sadli. Many of us actually being inspired by Pak Sadli. I personally one of the people in the project that relatively knows Pak Sadli very late. I just met him when I was in Ithaca through my mentor at the time, Iwan Jaya Aziz. And each time Pak Sadli come to Ithaca, we always have gathering and have a discussion. It was always enlightening for me to have those discussions. So please also allow me to introduce a bit more about the Indonesia project for those who already know, or for those who that's not very familiar with the project. The project was founded in 1965 by Professor Heinhardt, particularly with three goals. One is letting the world knows about development in Indonesia, particularly on the economic development of Indonesia. Second is that to conduct research and support research on Indonesian development by Indonesian and by international scholars. And finally, to participate in the debate on Indonesian economic policy. Our activity is as follows. So we have two groups of activities. One is research and capacity building. These are involving, the main one is Indonesia project staff research activities. We have P.hD students. We are honored to have Chatib as one of our products. We have visitor. That's true actually. We have a visitor program. We develop a research network among Australian researchers and Indonesian researchers. And we also provide incentive for Australians to work on Indonesia through a travel grant. And the other group that we are doing is research finding dissemination. The main one is the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies. We conduct a big conference each year in Canberra. We call it Indonesia Update Conference. And then we also have, together with the Ministry of Finance, conducting a high-level policy dialogue. We conduct an Indonesia study group in Canberra, and also in collaboration with about 11 to 12 institutions in Jakarta, we conduct a weekly seminar Forum Kajian Pembangunan. And we have 3 lectures in Indonesia. One is Sadli lecture, and then in June we conduct Hadis Susastra Policy Forum with CSIS, and finally we conduct Bulletin Economic Forum with Pajajaran University. We have also conducting various public lecture in Canberra, seminar, and we start to develop Indonesia Project blog. These are our main icon, the bulletin. It has been published in 1965. One important feature of the bulletin is that in each number there is a survey of recent development. So this is actually one source if one would like to understand the modern history of Indonesian economy. It is published by our department in Australia. Currently, the editor is Pierre van der Eng. And Pierre is supposed to be here, but he couldn't, and please accept his apology for that. There are also several Indonesian scholars participate in this production of the bulletin, including Pak Budiono, Pak Khatib Basri, Ibu Mari Pangestu, and Ibu Armida Syahbana, as well as Ari Kuntjoro, the Dean of the Faculty of Economics. Each year, when we do the Indonesia Update Conference, the following year we publish a book, and the next one will be in 2013, is Regional Dynamics and Decentralization in a Decentralized Indonesia. It will be launched June 9 in CSIS this year. The book is edited by Hal Hill. This year Indonesia Update, it will be in September in Canberra. If you happen to be in Australia, please visit. The topic will be the years, a critical assessment of his presidency. Marcus Mittner, Ed Espinal, and Dick Thompson will be the conveners. And several people will talk in this conference, including Dewi Fortuna Anwar, Sidney Jones, and Hal Hill. Finally, if you would like to know more about the project, you can visit and look at this link. That's it from me, and thank you very much, and hopefully you can enjoy this activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Budi Resosudarmo, for the welcoming remarks. Now I would like to invite Mr. Chatib Basri, P.hD, as the Minister of Finance, Republic of Indonesia, to give the keynote remarks. The floor is yours.
Yang saya hormati Ibu Saparina Sadli, Professor Peter McDonald, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. It is a great pleasure to be here to speak before the participants for the 8th Sadli lecture, and I'm very honored to deliver the keynote speech this morning. And I can see some of my former lecturers are here. Professor Dorodjatun, I took at least 2 of his class, history of economic history, and the other one is political economy in macroeconomic policy or something like that. And Ibu Tuning, because I learned about this demographic bonus from Ibu Tuning. So it's not always easy to speak before your former lecture. It's like the comprehensive examinations this morning. But before I deliver my keynote speech, I would like to share my personal experience with the late Professor Sadli. I've never been a student of Professor Sadli, but I know him since when I was a kid, because my late father was his Secretary General at the Ministry of Labor and Manpower back on 1973, if I'm not mistaken, until 78. So I knew him since I was small. And then later on, when I studied economics, I made a lot of contact with Professor Sadli. And I still recall, usually on Tuesday morning like this, at 7 a.m. in the morning, he called me to ask about some materials before he read something for the business news. Yeah, and Pak Sadli is always very straightforward and asking about all the economic issues before he put it in an article for the business news. And one of the interesting experience that I had with Pak Sadli, I recall was back on 2001, that I went to Tokyo for the ADBI conference with Pak Sadli. We arrived 6 o'clock in the morning in Narita. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, he called me to my room. And he said, Dede, I would like to go to Akihabara. This is the center for the electronic stuff in Tokyo. And we went together because Pak Sadli was very interested on gadget. Yeah, from like a notebook. And then he found out about something that he was very interested. And he asked the guy there, but he was speaking Bahasa Indonesia. And I said to Pak Sadli, they don't understand Bahasa Indonesia, Pak. And the response from Pak Sadli is, they don't speak English and also Bahasa Indonesia. Why I waste my time speaking English? So it's typical of, very practical of Pak Sadli. Now, in honor of Pak Sadli, I would like to share my view regarding this demography of Indonesian comparative perspective. I'm not an expert on this. My little knowledge I got from my former teacher, Ibu Tuning here. But let me share my view regarding putting the demographic issue of Indonesia in the global context. About 10 to 15 years from now, I can see at least there are several fundamental changes in the global economy. The first one is looking at the global imbalances, like twin deficit in the United States, both on the fiscal side and the current account side. I don't think the advanced country like United States or Europe can sustain as the locomotive of trade. Why? Because the continuation of the fiscal deficit and also the current account deficit will bring the advanced country into deep financial crisis in the future. So somehow there should be change of the behavior of the advanced country. For example, I can imagine that 10 to 15 years from now, US should start to think to become an exporter. This is probably something strange, but looking at the current account deficit problem, somehow US has to try to reduce the dependency, import dependency, and try to become exporter. The second one, with the problem on the fiscal side and the aging population in the United States, somehow this will push the United States to become safer rather than spender. And this would happen also in the European countries. If you look at the problem of the welfare, the burden on the fiscal side, the aging population, this somehow will drive the advanced country to become safer. Then the question is, who is going to be the locomotive of trade? And the answer is, will be Asia. Why? Because China, probably 10 to 15 years from now, will become the largest economic in the world. Yeah? And if we're talking about Asia, there are three center poles of growth. This would be India and South Asia, the second one, Japan and East Asia, and the third one, Southeast Asia. And if you're talking about Southeast Asia, there is indispensable country, which in terms of size is around 50% of the total Southeast Asian economy. And in terms of population, is around 42% of the total Southeast Asian population. And this country is named Indonesia. So I can see that 10 to 15 years from now, it is inevitable that Indonesia will have the potential to become a major player in the global world. The second issue, with the US producing the shale gas now, this probably will change the landscape of the energy equilibrium in the global economy in the future. If the US can produce the shale gas only $3 or less than $3, this will make US become less dependent to the Middle East. Once US becomes less dependent to the Middle East, the demand for the energy, at least from the domestic side, may decline quite substantially. And we can see the new interesting development that in terms of geopolitics, the Saudi Arabia start to make a conversation with the Israel now, or the United States start to make a conversation with Iran. They somehow is affected by the changing of the landscape of the global energy as well. And what will be the implication for a country like Indonesia? If the US become less dependent to the Middle East in terms of energy, then energy price 10 to 15 years from now may decline. And in the past 10 years, we witnessed the positive correlations between energy price and commodity prices. Why? Because commodity has been used for the substitute for the energy. If the energy price collapses, then there is a possibility that commodity price will also decline. Unfortunately, the country like Indonesia, 65% of our export comprised of energy and commodity related. So if Indonesia continue to rely only on natural resources, this would be a big problem for us. So if you learn from the history of economic development, there were three countries that entered the middle income. It was Brazil, South Africa, and South Korea. And only South Korea managed to become new industrial economies. Why? Because they emphasize on the issue of the innovation and technology. So again, the issue with the changing of the global pattern, that will be on the human capital. In the first issue, the changing of the landscape of the global world, Asia will become the locomotive of trade. But the question is, how can Indonesia play a major role when Asia become a big player in the global economy 10 to 15 years from now? The answer will be on the three issues: infrastructure, human capital, and governance. Let me focus on the issue of the human capital first. I mentioned to you earlier that the future of the locomotive of trade will be in Asia. And I can imagine the advanced country will become an importer later on, become an exporter later on, and the demand will come from Asia. Why? Because the growing middle class in China, probably around 2 billion, maybe we will have about 3 billion people middle class in Asia 10 to 15 years from now. So I won't be surprised if that in the future the demand this will come from the middle class. And what is the role of this demographic bonus? Correct me if I'm wrong, Ibu Tuning. If I recall when I took your class, there is one study done by Bloomberg and Modigliani regarding this life cycle hypothesis. It's a very simple argument that the economic growth will somehow depend on this demographic pattern, because between the age to 15 years old, people continue to consume but without income. So we will have these negative savings. Between 15 to 65, people start to join the labor market, start to work, you earn income, at the same time you also consume. But after you retire, after 65, then you continue to consume, but no income. Then you will again have the same thing. So it means that the golden age, the productive age, will be around 15 to 65 years old. And if you look at the composition of our population now, correct me if I'm wrong, 50% of our population is aged around 29 to 30 years old. Am I right? 60? 67%. 67%. You can imagine, if 67% of the population is between around 29 to 30 years old, this is really the productive things. And you can imagine that the consumption will be very strong. And if you look at the composition of our GDP, in which around 55% of our GDP contributed by consumption, then you can imagine the demand for several products may continue to increase. And this is also consistent with the new trend of the rising middle class here in Indonesia. It is very interesting to look at, to observe about the new behavior of this middle class. I said that when I was a kid, the queue that I saw, it was when there was a soccer match between Persija and Persebaya or PSMS Medan. But now the youngsters are queuing for buying a ticket for Justin Bieber or the Korean pop singer like Kiboom, Siwon, 2 AM, 2 PM. And if you look at in the shopping mall, people are queuing for buying gadget. And this is something that never happened about 30 years ago. If you look at another observations, Professor McDonald, one of the problem of many ambassadors, foreign ambassadors here in Indonesia, if they organize a cocktail reception and they send an invitation, nobody reply the RSVP. Because here in Indonesia, we always believe that every time we come to the party, the food and drink is always available. We don't have any scarcity problem. But it doesn't happen now. If you want to go for fine dining, even for the fancy restaurant, if you don't make a reservation a day before, you won't get a seat or table. It shows again that even culinary, it's become a leisure. So under this kind of situation, I can imagine there were about 3 major business in the future that will become very lucrative. The first one is education, because this middle class will continue to demand education. The second one is health business, and I can imagine now, look at how many Indonesians are going to Singapore, to Penang, to Thailand for this health sectors, yeah. And then also the last one is leisures. Unfortunately, if not doing very well in terms of capturing all this opportunity. And I will say that Singapore has been very aggressive to capture this, both on those 3 issues: education, health, and also leisures. Now they established this Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. They provide this concert hall for many musicians come to Singapore, and many Indonesians are traveling to Singapore just to watch this concert. Now we start to have this similar event here also in Indonesia. And what I was trying to say, this kind of observation, this kind of situation did not happen about 30 years ago. So even the consumer behavior changed because this growing middle class. The new business will become the new pattern of business in the future could be different, like what we are facing now. And let me advise you, if any one of you wants to be a president by 2024, don't talk about the rural area, because by that time 75% of our population will live in urban. So anyone could be a president if he or she can handle the issue of the clean water, transportation, traffic jam, public facility, including housing. Perhaps no longer emphasize on the rural issue. So this is the way, this is the Indonesia that we are facing in the future with the changing of the global pattern. We can see that we do have a role here. We can play as a major player. But unfortunately, this potential can only be maximized or be materialized if they are supported by the good quality of the human capital. And there is one interesting observation in the past 10 years. When I was in Washington about a week ago at the IMF restricted breakfast meeting, I was asked to speak about the future of the emerging market in Asia. What's going to happen? There is one interesting development that the productivity gap between the United States and Asian countries is declining now. And the reason behind it is not because Asia is catching up, but the productivity in the US declined due to the aging population. The similar thing also applies in Europe, in Japan, in China. So you can see Indonesia has this potential here. But again, a country like Indonesia cannot continue to rely on these natural resources or cheap labor. If you're talking about cheap labor, Indonesia cannot compete with the Bangladesh. The Bangladeshi, their wage of their worker probably only 1/3 compared to us. If you want to compete on the garment business, there is no way that Indonesia can compete with Bangladesh. But if Indonesia would like to stay in the garment business, what we need to do is try to find a niche market. With the growing middle class, there is a niche market now for the fashion product like batik. Because this middle class, they are willing to pay batik with thousands of US dollars now. It didn't happen about 30 years ago. So it means that Indonesia has to move into the next stage of development. For example, in terms of quality of human resources by introducing design. When I said about improvement of this quality of human resources, don't think that we are going to build a skyrocket or aircraft industry. But we continue to maintain our comparative advantage, but emphasize on the role of the innovation and technology. Only by doing that, we can catch up about the productivity gap between Asian countries like Indonesia and the United States. There are some studies done by some of my colleagues, it's not here perhaps, about the labor productivity. If you look at the labor productivity in Indonesia, the total productivity relatively stagnant since 1998. So it means that the future growth will be on the quality of human capital. In terms of quantity, we have enough size of the 67% of the populations are the young populations, but the question is about the quality. That's the first one. The second one is, look at the experience of Korea and Japan. When they had a baby boom, Japan perhaps in the late 60s and the Korea in the late 70s, they grew by around 10 to 11%. So if Japan and Korea has been successful to accumulate growth and now are facing the problem of aging population, can you imagine if Indonesia continue to grow only 6 to 7%? What's going to happen about 20 years from now? It means that we need to catch up. Otherwise, this demographic bonus will end up with this demographic catastrophe unless we do something on this issue of the human capital. Now the question is, what will be the policy implication? I see this trend, the pattern of new development about the importance of this human capital. If anyone take the class of economic growth, of endogenous growth, one of the most important contribution for the endogenous growth is the human capital. And this is the only factor production that doesn't have this diminishing return in terms of this increasing quality of the human capital. So now at the Ministry of Finance, I can see that I know this administration will end only about 6 months from now. But at least we provide a ground for the next administration to handle this issue. What kind of policy that we are preparing? Now we are giving a tax incentive for the company who would like to build the R&D in Indonesia. I know that there is a tax incentive now by giving tax rebate about 25% if the company would like to establish R&D in Indonesia. But I think this 25% is too small. Now we are thinking and put emphasis on the possibility of double deduction. So if you spend about $100 for the R&D, then you can have the tax deduction double of $100, $200 US. This will give an incentive that later on the foreign investment or any investment to come to Indonesia, or even including the domestic direct investment, to start to emphasize on the issue of the R&D. That's the first one. Because without that, I think a bit difficult for Indonesia to catch up. The second one is on the training issues. Ibu Sab, I learned this idea from the late Professor Sadli in one of our discussion in the morning, because he was the Minister of Manpower. So he shared with me about his experience when he was the Minister of Manpower at the time. And he said that he didn't believe in this government training center. And I share his view, because to the best of my knowledge, many graduates from the government training center need to be retrained again. Why? Because the equipment is outdated, does not match with the one in the company. So the basic solution for this, rather than, and the government have the limited budget for this, rather than asking the government to build the training center, why don't we ask the private sector to do a training? It's like on-the-job training. And as an incentive, we give a tax deductible. Yeah, because otherwise there is no incentive again for them to do that. And this is much more appropriate, because what they need, in the company, it's really like the vocational training. I can mention, I don't want to mention the name of the bank, but many of the bankers in Indonesia are alumni for several foreign banks here. It's because they were trained at the foreign bank, at the foreign banks at the time, and later on become the bankers of many Indonesian banks now. So that kind of approach perhaps can be done in order to improve the quality of human resources. Only by doing this, we can handle the issue of this demographic bonus. If we don't do anything related to this, then this demographic bonus will end up, as I said, as demographic catastrophe. The other thing that I would like to emphasize, and this is also related to the issue of this demographic bonus in the future, is the role of policy. Because I do believe that the future of Indonesian, the future comparative advantage will be no longer physical capital asset. You cannot continue to rely only on natural resources. So the future comparative advantage will be intangible asset. And if you're talking about intangible assets, that will be a policy. So country will discriminate about their decision to invest in one particular country to other countries simply by looking at their policy. And I can give a simple example of it. Last year, just a month after I was appointed as a Minister of Finance, Indonesia were facing a big trouble because Chairman Bernanke at the time decided to do, at least he did not decide to do a tapering, but he gave a sign to the market that the Fed will end the quantitative easing policy. And as a result, market reacted. And one of the countries that hit severely by this tapering off was Indonesia, together with India, South Africa, Brazil, and Turkey. And if you look at these similarities among those countries that I mentioned, India, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, and also Brazil, they do have problems either in the current account deficit or fiscal deficit. A country like Indonesia, we don't have problem in the fiscal deficit because we are lucky. It is stipulated in our law that the maximum budget deficit was 3%. It was passed by the parliament when Professor Dorodjatun was the accounting minister at the time, back on 2003. So we are blessed by this. So your position as a Minister of Finance not as difficult as other Minister of Finance in the European countries, because if the budget deficit reaches 3%, then you can say, I would like to expand this budget deficit, but the law does not allow me to do so. Yeah. So it is good to have that. But our problem at the time was the current account deficit, because our current account deficit was around 4.4% of GDP, or $10 billion US. So Indonesia was punished by the market. And you can see that rupiah was hit. There was a capital outflow. So we decided to respond to the situation. This is back to the ECO 101. If you look at the textbook, I really like this because it's really a textbookish. The Riviera Batis International Finance. If you got a problem with the current account deficit, you only have two choices. Either you handle the issue on the supply side, introducing this productivity, but takes time, or just focus on the demand side by slowing down the economy. If you choose to slowing down the economy, you have two choices there. You do the expenditure switching or expenditure reducing. If you want to do the expenditure reducing and combine of the expenditure switching, what you need to do is just tightening the monetary policy, tightening fiscal by cutting the fuel subsidy, and let the exchange rate to depreciate. By this recipe, within 4 months, we've been able to lower the current account deficit from 4.4% of GDP to become 1.9% of GDP, from $10 billion US to become $4 billion US. Then, I will say that the current situation is much better than what we had about 6 months ago. And if you look at some articles, they changed the title now. Like in the Financial Times, they said that Indonesia stands out after the tapering off, or economists said that no more fragile. My point is, investor at the end of the day will differentiate between countries. If you come up with a good policy response, and then you will be able to restore the confidence. But in order to come up with a good policy, again, you need a good quality of people. And this is back again to the issue of this quality of human resources. I rather obsess about this because, to be honest with you, I have to be frank, that in terms of education level attainment, Indonesia is perhaps not one of the best in Southeast Asia. If you compare with Philippines, our education level attainment even below the Philippines. This is the thing that we need to catch up in order to reap the benefit of this demographic bonus. So I do believe this morning that at the Sadli lecture, Professor Peter McDonald will enlighten us about this, the demography of Indonesian comparative perspective, perhaps making, I don't know, comparison, because there are other countries who are also having this demographic bonus, like Bangladesh, like Philippines, like Nigeria. And if you look at those countries, all those countries, they grow by more than 6% now. So we can see that the potential of this demographic bonus, but without the support from the quality of human resources, then this demographic bonus will end up with this demographic catastrophe. So I end my speech here, and once again, I would like to congratulate the Australian National University, the Institute for Economic and Social Research of the Faculty of Economics, University of Indonesia, and I believe that you will have this a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Minister of Finance, for the very enlightening keynote remarks. Without further ado, we will move to the lecture session, which will be chaired by Head of Public Finance and Policy Research Group, Institute of Social and Economic Research, Mr. Adrison, Ph.D. So I would like to invite the speakers, Professor Peter McDonald, and the discussant, Professor Moertiningsih and Mr. Budi Resosudarmo, to come up to the stage up front, Mr. Adrison as well, to chair the session. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Adrison. Thank you.
Yang saya hormati Ibu Saparina Sadli, Your Excellency Minister of Finance Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Muhammad Basri, Professor Dorodjatun from FEUI, the Director of Institute for Economic and Social Research, Faculty of Economic, University of Indonesia, Pak Kadek Dian Sutrisna, and Professor Peter McDonald, Professor Moertiningsih, and Professor Budi Resosudarmo. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. First of all, please allow me to express my sincere welcome to all of you joining us in the 8th Sadli lectures. This is an annual event hosted by ALPM, FEUI, and the ANU Indonesian project. As we have heard from the welcoming remarks, that the objective of the Sadli lecture is to broaden understanding and stimulate debate among academia and policymakers on the key economic issues and challenges faced by the Indonesians. And the signature of the Sadli lecture series is that it draws an experience from neighboring countries, such that we can learn lesson learned, which is good for better policy making in Indonesia. And in this year Sadli's lectures, the topic is demography in Indonesia, demography of Indonesia in comparative perspective. You can see that probably some of you may have known that the fertility rate of Indonesia is decreasing in the past 40 years, and now it reached at 2.4 the fertility rate. And if it is sustained, we can expect a substantial amount of population, which is some of people may think that it's going to be a problem. It's going to be an obstacle in the continued economic development. So there's a view to reduce the fertility rate to 2.1. But the experience in neighboring countries such as Thailand, Singapore, and Japan has shown that there's additional potential problems handling a low fertility rate, especially on the effect on the labor market. So to discuss these issues, we are pleased to have three distinguished professors here. We are going to have Professor Peter McDonald from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Adrison, and then Ibu Tuning, the feminine name for Ibu Asli Moertiningsih is Ibu Tuning from Faculty of Economics, University of Indonesia, and also Pak Budi Resosudarmo from the ANU Indonesia project. So the sequence of the presentation is going. We are going to have a presentation, a full hour by Professor Peter McDonald, and then we are going to have a discussion, a response to the article by Professor Ibu Tuning, and then followed by discussion led by Professor Budi Resosudarmo. So after that, we are going to have a question and answer sessions, and then the closing remark. So without further ado, Pak Peter, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih, Pak Vid. It's a great honor for me to be giving the Sadli lecture today with the Minister doing the introduction and Pak Dorodjatun. I've exchanged my personal history with Pak Dorodjatun earlier on, but we won't go into that. But we have a long history as well. My personal history in regard to demography and population studies in Indonesia goes back a very long way. I first came to Indonesia to teach a course in demography at the University of Indonesia in 1971. And this was at the Lembaga Demography at the University of Indonesia, led at that time by Professor Nathaniel Iskandar. And in beginning this talk, I think it's important for me to acknowledge the important contribution that Professor Iskandar made to the development of demography in this country. He was responsible for the training in population studies of numerous people, and a very, very important role. One of my very first papers, in fact, was in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, way back, which was an account of the 1971 population census of Indonesia. As I say, long history. And then I came back to Indonesia again in 1973, and I was here for 3-4 years at the University of Indonesia working, and continued to work on Indonesia right through the 1970s. I then moved away from working on Indonesia for quite some period of time, and have returned in maybe over the last 7 or 8 years to be working once more on Indonesia and on the demography of Indonesia. I never met Professor Sadli, or maybe I saw him in the distance, but I did work at the University of Indonesia when it was in the Faculty of Economics was in Salemba. The floor on which I was working was immediately below the floor where LPAM was located, so I have at least that connection. But in fact, I have a much stronger connection with Ibu Sadli, having in this last 5 years or so been involved in joint research with Ibu Sadli. And I've travelled to different parts of Indonesia with Ibu Sadli in this work, which was generated by Dr. Ibu Tomo, who's here today. I'd also like to thank the Indonesia Project for considering demography as an important issue for the Sadli lectures. If you look back over the Sadli lectures, there are 7 before this, which are all very much in the field of economics, but this time around they've decided that demography was worth a Sadli lecture, and I thank them for choosing me to give the lecture. And I hope that I can bring out some context of the importance of demography in economic development. Now, I am going to go back some time in Indonesian history, back to the context of what we're talking about today. And the context does very much go back to the 1960s, 1970s technocrats, of which Professor Sadli was one. Essentially, there was the viewpoint at that time, strongly expressed, that reducing population growth through the reduction of fertility, of course, was an important aspect of development, that it was a crucial aspect of economic development. And when Suharto was the acting president of Indonesia back in 1967, he signed a statement, which is a very, very interesting statement, and it's quoted in the paper if you want to read the full statement. It was signed by 30 heads of government, 1967, and in part it said, "We believe that the population problem must be recognised as a principal element in long-range national planning if governments are to achieve their economic goals." But it also said, interestingly, "We believe that lasting and meaningful peace will depend to a considerable measure upon how the challenge of population growth is met." Now, this was signed by 30 heads of government, including acting President Suharto at that time, and it was the beginning of an approach to control of population in Indonesia. Where did this idea come from? Well, it goes back much further, and it goes back essentially to what is a Cold War strategy of the United States. In the Cold War period, there was a fight for the hearts and minds of the people in the countries, the developing countries, going on. Very, very strong battle between these two sides. And on one side, the United States believed that if the populations could develop, essentially with a capitalist model, that they would move towards that side of the Cold War. But population growth was an obstacle to this. And this was an argument made essentially by Princeton demographers who produced work which actually was about the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is a kind of terminology that's arisen fairly recently. But you can go right back to the 1950s, a book by Cole and Hoover, which was a modelling exercise showing that if you were able to reduce the fertility rate, you would change the age structure of the population. There would be, back in those days, age structures looked like this with lots of children, 40% of the population under the age of 15. In that kind of circumstance, so much of the country's potential needed to be applied to the survival, etc., of children. And so the idea was that if you reduce this very wide base of population pyramid, and you change the age structure, then you did not have to spend, both the country and the families did not have to spend quite so much money on all those children, and that capital then could be invested in productive investment. As far as the nation was concerned, and as far as the family was concerned, it could be spent on the education of children, so that both at the macro and the micro level, you could push development forward much more rapidly, so long as you reduce the birth rate. That's the essential idea, and that is the idea of today of the demographic dividend as well, about the age structure of the population. And if you look back in the history, this was an idea primarily of the demographer. Well, the idea goes back a really long time in the United States. In fact, it goes back into the 1920s with a demographer named Warren Thompson, a US demographer. Essentially developed this idea in the 1920s, but it was taken up by Princeton demographers, particularly Frank Notestein and Ansley Cole. And interestingly, two demographers, Warren Thompson, who I've just mentioned, and Frank Lorimer, both kind of associated with Princeton, worked for the MacArthur administration in Japan after the war. So there were two senior US demographers working in this for the MacArthur administration. And part of their message was to bring down the birth rate in Japan. And that happened. So that in the 1950s, Japan was really the first developing country, or it wasn't quite so developing at that time, but it was the first country that had a high birth rate, which was not a kind of Western country, where the birth rate started to fall, and it started to fall in the 1950s. And this idea actually, another very important part of the idea was that you could bring down the birth rate without necessarily having economic development first. So the previous ideas, the ideas about birth rates back from European history, were that birth rates came down because the economy developed and industrialization and so on. So you had to have development first, and then the demography changed. Now the demographers in the demographic dividend kind of school were saying you could do the reverse, that you could bring down the birth rate and then development would be enhanced. So that was a kind of radical idea, and was different to, you may have heard the phrase, development is the best contraceptive, which was the 1970s terminology, which was counter to the idea that you could actually bring down the birth rate before the country developed, and that would then stimulate the development. So who was right? Well, Indonesia is one of the classic examples, I think, where the fertility rate did fall, largely prior to economic development. It was before economic development. So there are lots of examples where this is the case, but if you look around the world at the countries where fertility fell, particularly in Asia, countries where the birth rate fell rapidly, are also the countries where economic development really took off. So if you look at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the so-called Asian tigers, Thailand, now Indonesia. And also, interestingly, although this was a kind of American capitalist idea in that Cold War type context, the one-child policy in China has the same origins. So Deng Xiaoping was a major sponsor of the one-child policy, based on his expressed view that China would not be able to develop its economy or raise its living standard unless the birth rate fell rapidly. So the idea was taken up also with China, and of course China has also developed very rapidly. So the evidence is quite strong, I think, for this idea that if you're able to change the age structure of the population, you do not have the burden of a very high proportion of children in the population, then economic development can take place much more rapidly. Okay, well that's the history of why we decided to bring down birth rates around the world, and we still do. We still have this idea that, particularly in Africa today, where birth rates are quite high, that the birth rate should be brought down, and economic development will follow in Africa if we're able to do that. But what we didn't predict was that the theory was that birth rates were 5 or 6 children per woman, and then they come down, and by the theory they hit two births per woman, which is the number you need to just reproduce the population and have 0 population growth, and that would be the end of history. That everybody would have 2 births for the rest of time, age structures would never change. If you have 0 population growth, then age structures are exactly the same, the population is exactly the same. You never need demographers because everything is totally predictable with the 0 population growth. The age structure, the numbers at each age, everything else. That was the theory, but that's pretty. You don't expect humankind to behave with such regularity, and unfortunately they haven't. And in lots of countries, what we've seen is not the birth rate falling down to 2 and stopping at 2, it kept going. And we now find lots of countries in the world, some 30, 40 countries, where the birth rate is now below 1.5 births per woman, which I call very low fertility. And very low fertility is a new major problem. And because instead of the age distribution looking like this, with the children at the bottom, the age distribution looks like this, with loads of people at the older ages, not so many in the middle, and very few children. And we're already observing countries taking on these age structures due to low fertility. And one of the major policy issues around the world today in demography, in the population field, is how do you get the birth rate up? So we spent all this time working out how to bring the birth rate down, but now in a lot of European countries, in the wealthier East Asian countries, the most important policy, demographic policy, is how do you push the birth rate up? Because when the age structure is like this, the population grows very, very rapidly when there are lots of children, because the children grow up and become parents, and there's what we call population momentum from the age structure. If you have an age structure like this, the reverse is true. You get population decline, and there's a momentum to the population decline as well. Just think that if the birth rate was 1 birth per woman, and some countries in East Asia in particular are quite close to that, 1 birth per woman, Taiwan, South Korea, and you take generations, so here's the initial generation, they have 1 birth, so this next generation is half the size of the original one. If you keep that birth rate going, the next one down is 1/4 the size of the original generation. And then another generation, the third one, it's 1/8 the size of the original generation. And that all happens in 90 years, because demographic generations are 30 years long. So you can have a drop in population of that severity in a short period of time. And of course, the other economic problem that emerges from this situation is the fall in the labour force. So that before your population fall becomes an issue, it's the fall in the labour force, in the size of the labour force, that becomes very, very significant. So part of the context we need to consider is whether Indonesia might head down into that kind of situation. Now, I thought, well, in the past this probably wouldn't happen. However, there's some interesting countries now moving into this group that have the very low fertility, under 1.5. The most interesting one in this region is Thailand. Thailand's birth rate is already below 1.5. And the Thai government now has a policy approach to increase its birth rate. Not so far away from Indonesia in all kinds of different ways. Thailand has already taken up a policy to increase its birth rate. Another country in development terms, rather like Indonesia, is Brazil. And Brazil is rapidly heading to that situation of having a birth rate below 1.5. So it's something to watch out for, and I'll come back to that. Now I'm going to take you through some slides, and I'm going to address issues such as the fertility in Indonesia and its future, the age structure, demographic dividend, migration, aging, the distribution of the population, urbanization, and so on. And I'm going to address that in comparative perspective, as this lecture requires, by comparing with other Southeast Asian countries, a selection of large countries in Asia, China, India, and Iran, and comparing Indonesia also, interestingly, with 3 developed countries, Japan, Singapore, and Australia. All right, so let's get into this. Okay. But at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about another issue, which is the kind of sub-issue of this lecture, is that the demographic data in Indonesia is very weak. The demographic data is not good quality in general. That there are a lot of unknowns. And solving those unknowns, I think, is a very important issue for Indonesia. You can see here intercensal population growth rates in Indonesia, annual growth rates for the 4 intercensal periods. And I've shown you 3 versions. One is the first one is the actual raw counts from Indonesia, from the censuses, the actual numbers counted in the census. And you see, if you believe this set of numbers, that for the last 20 years, 1990 to 2010, there was no change in Indonesia's population growth rate. 1.4, no change at all. So if the aim for Indonesia was to bring its population growth rate down towards 0, nothing's happened for the last 20 years, according to that raw. And it's still relatively high, around 1.4. Now, the United Nations Population Division makes estimates of all of the countries in the world, of their demography, and they publish their estimates once every 2 years. And so there's the 2010 revision in the middle there. And you see in this, the United Nations view of Indonesia and its growth over time is of a nicely declining trend in the 2010 numbers from the United Nations. So you would look at that set of numbers and say, okay, things are moving along quite well. There's a continual decline going on, and it'll just continue, and it'll reach the kind of target that we're interested in. 2012 comes along, and the 2012 revision from the United Nations had the benefit of the 2010 census, of course, of Indonesia, and they changed their views of what the growth rates in Indonesia were, much more like the raw counts. And so the United Nations is now giving the more pessimistic view of declining population growth in Indonesia, not the more optimistic view, which is in the middle. So here's the international agency responsible for population estimation and numbers, changing its view completely about Indonesia. Now, it can only do that because the numbers are not terribly reliable, so that you have to, you can, and it'd be interesting to see what the next one says. But let me just show you this one. What I've done here is the 2010 United Nations numbers and the 2012 United Nations numbers in the 2 columns. And it's just a percentage of the UN's estimate of population above the raw census count. So looking at the first number, 1971, 1.5, so the 2010 numbers from the UN said that the population in Indonesia in 1971 was actually 1.5% higher than was counted in the census. That's what the number means, 1.5%. So it goes 1.5% higher, so that is the undercount, as it were, in the census. It's 1.5%, 2.6% in 1980, 3.2, 3.6 in 2000, but only 1.1 in 2010. So censuses conventionally have undercounts. It's not unusual to have that kind of undercount for a census. You'll get that kind of undercount in the United States. You'll get that kind of undercount in Australia as well. So those kind of undercounts are not unusual. But in the 2012 revision, the UN has revised historically Indonesia's population right back to 1971, and the minus percent, minus 2.2% 1971, minus 1% 1980, the UN is saying that Indonesia actually overcounted the population in the census in those 2 years. And in 1990, it got the count exactly right. Almost, if you look at the numbers, it's really almost down to hundreds difference from the raw count. And then 1.5 undercount. Now, to me, this is just tidak masuk akal. It's unreasonable to say that Indonesia overcounted its population back in the past, that there was an overcount. So the 2012 numbers from the UN have problems. You would not expect to have an overcount. Also, given the quality of the 2000 and the 2010 censuses, you would expect the undercount to be much higher in 2000 than it was in 2010. 2010 censuses quality is much, much better. But, you know, then in the 2012 UN numbers, 1.5% undercounted both of those censuses, although the 2010 census quality was much better, everybody believes, than was the 2000. So again, here's numbers from the UN, which are just mystifying in some ways. And so that's part of our problem. Okay, I'll come back a bit to accuracy of data as we go through this. I need to be able to see these slides myself, which is a little bit difficult from here. But these are the rates of growth. Now I'm taking from now on in these comparative numbers, I am using the United Nations 2012 numbers because I have to use some comparative source, which is kind of consistent. So they are all from the United Nations 2012 numbers. And you can see the rates of growth and Indonesia's ranking across time. So that 1970 to 75, Indonesia is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the fifth one down, fifth highest rate of growth. But then it moves to a lower level after that. But interestingly, in the by the period 2005 to 2010, Indonesia's growth rate has moved to a lower ranking in this list of countries, but only because Singapore and Australia have gone in the other direction. Two of those countries have moved to become the highest growth rate countries in these regional countries. Singapore with the highest growth rate and Australia with the second highest growth rate. So that these two advanced countries, now remember that, these are, there was the idea, okay, if you want to develop rapidly, then you need a low population growth rate. Here's two countries, Singapore and Australia, going in another direction. They have a high population growth rate. They have high economic development. Why? Because they're dealing with their demographic dividend issue through migration. So instead of having the birth type approach to the demographic dividend, what both of those countries do is bring in a lot of people into the working ages. And they deal with they are dealing with the demographic dividend issue through migration. I work a lot on Australian migration, and migration in Australia is now running at all-time highs. We import, in net terms, 1 million people every 4 years, which is very, very high from any past, given the population of Australia being just over 20 million. To be bringing in 1 million migrants every 4 years is very, very considerable. And Singapore, this growth rate from migration is even higher than Australia's. And there was a white paper recently in Singapore, which was, Singapore has been trying to raise its birth rate now for 20 years, largely unsuccessful, and it's kind of thrown its hands in the air and said, let's use migration instead. So they're using migrants because they can't raise the birth rate of the Chinese population in Singapore. But, and you'll also notice as we project forward in time on the bottom, 2030 to 2035, that some of the countries have dropped into a negative terms, that their populations are actually falling, including China. There's a lot of interesting discussion about China and its population, and the Chinese government for many years published a number, 1.8 births per woman as China's fertility from 1991 right through to 2010 or so. The birth rate never changed. It was 1.8. The demographers who were trying to estimate China's birth rate said right through this period China's birth rate was falling, and that the 1.8 number was false. And there is now some recognition of this. The United Nations has finally reduced China's birth rate, estimated birth rate, and so China is now one of those countries where the birth rate is below 1.5 births per woman in that low fertility bracket. This will lead to a decline of population, very sharp decline of workers in the young end of the labour force. That in the next about the next 30 years, the number of young workers in China in the young ages is going to fall in half. It'll be half of what it is now. Demographers have been saying to the Chinese government over and over, you need to get rid of the one-child policy, and even if you do, you've still got problems. Because the birth rate probably won't rise. It'll still be very low. So that's one of the big issues for the future, that China, with its rapid development, Chinese development in the eastern part of China has been very dependent on bringing workers from further west into the eastern part, with the 150 million floating population, as they call them, 150 million people moving from the west into the east, into the eastern cities where the development zones are. In the next 20-30 years, China's going to need another 150 million moving in that way, just to keep the population the same it is now, in the working ages. Where are they going to come from? Well, it's a bit harder. As you move further west, the education levels drop. The people don't want to move to the east. There are different cultures, and so there's China has this major problem, a labour force problem in the future. And it's a problem similar to Japan. Of course, Japan also has a labour force problem it already has this very low birth rate. Well, this is just, I won't dwell on this graph, but this is just showing you that the two countries that have the very high growth rates today, the two advanced countries, developed countries, Singapore and Australia, it's due to the red bars, which is migration, which I've already said. That they have quite relatively low natural increase, both countries, but very high growth rates from migration. Okay, let's compare the age structures of Indonesia and Thailand. On the top you've got Indonesia and Thailand in 1970. Both have this classic kind of wide distribution with lots of children. Thailand's birth rate at that time was a bit higher than Indonesia's, and so their pyramid's a bit wider at the bottom. Both embarked upon quite aggressive family planning programs to bring the birth rate down. But by 2010, the distributions are looking a bit different, as I mentioned before. Indonesia still has, it's not this wide pyramid, but it doesn't have the Thai pyramid is tapering at the bottom. There are fewer children than at higher ages. And you can see that the biggest age groups in Thailand are, aging up to the middle of the working ages, 40 to 44, 45 to 40, 35 to 39. So it's those kind of age groups are the older ones, and they'll just get older, while the bottom of the pyramid is getting smaller. So That's the kind of problem I was talking about before, that countries can find themselves in when fertility falls very, very below this 1.5 threshold. And as I said, you can get hold of Thailand has a policy document to increase the fertility rate in Thailand. It's quite a good document. They did quite a lot of consultation, and whether it works is another matter. There are very few instances in the world where fertility was below 1.5. There's been a policy to raise it, but they have succeeded. Not very often. One of the examples is Russia, in fact, where the fertility rate did fall down to 1.3. It is up now about 1.7. So Russia is a case where the policy changed things. The other is the province of Quebec in Canada. Again, fertility was down to 1.3, but policy changes brought it up to about 1.7. Eastern Central European countries are more likely to succeed in bringing the birth rate back up again. And there are other examples as well, the Czech Republic and Estonia and so on. So, but in Asia, the attempts to raise the birth rate, once it dropped to very low levels, have been singularly unsuccessful. And we can go into that later if we like, about why that's the case. This is Indonesia projected, and showing the 2010 population is the shaded part, and then the 2050 population projected. Essentially what happens in this is that under the age of 40, there's very little change in the numbers in Indonesia. They're roughly the same as they are now. 40 years out, the numbers are much the same as they are now. The only change is that the numbers at the older ages get much bigger. So it's not that the numbers at the bottom get smaller, as is the case in a lot of other countries. They stay about the same, but you've got a lot more older people, which gives rise to the notion about, well, how long are we going to work? We'll come back to that in policy terms. This is the comparison of countries with the percentage of the population aged 65 and over, the ageing issue, 2010 and 2050. And you see some countries like Japan, for example, get quite old, you know, by historical reckoning. Almost 40% of the population in Japan by 2050 being aged 65 years and over. And that's very high, and that's one of the highest. That is the highest projected for the world. Some European countries kind of approach that, but Japan is the champion in this regard. But notice that China comes up as number 3 in this list. And maybe Singapore will not be quite as old, depending upon the aging of the migration policies. But China becomes the third oldest of these countries. So aging is a major issue for China. But Indonesia is there still, you know, under 20%. That's still relatively young. You know, there are lots of countries today have more than 20% of their population aged 65 and over. Indonesia will still be below that 20% number in 2050. So in regard to aging, Indonesia has some time compared to, say, China, or certainly compared to Japan. Aging is less the case in India and Philippines, principally because of their still relatively high birth rates, particularly in the Philippines. Now these numbers are taken from the recently published official projections from BPS of the population of Indonesia from 2010 to 2035, and these are important from the perspective of the demographic dividend, or the dependency rate, which is shown at the end there. or probably the best column to look at, as we heard from the Minister this morning, is the percentage age 15 to 64. The percentage of the population aged 15 to 64, the so-called working ages, hardly changes at all over this long period. Remains about 2/3, and 2/3 is quite high by any kind of international standard. So if we think of the demographic dividend as a concentration, a high number in that column age 15 to 64, then Indonesia has that high number, according to these projections, for quite some time. So Indonesia has lots of opportunity to take advantage of a demographic dividend right through till the end of the numbers that we see here. What happens in Indonesia is a shift from the young ages to the old ages, essentially, in the distribution. The middle remains the same. Of course, within the age distribution, as we saw earlier on, in the 15 to 64 age range, more of them are on the top end, the older end, than on the younger end over time. So a focus of development needs to be upon those kind of people who are going to be age 45 and over, 45 to 64, that they are not forgotten in the future. Okay, turning to the fertility rates, and I've got 1970 and 2010 showing them here, the rankings of all of these different countries. Indonesia's fertility was relatively low, actually, back in 1970 in this comparative league table. But between 1970 and 2010, although fertility fell in Indonesia, it's been passed by quite a number of countries, so that have moved to lower levels in Indonesia. So Indonesia's ranking it's moved up to the second highest of all of these countries, from being one of the lowest originally. A number around 2.5 for its fertility, estimated by the United Nations in its 2012 revision. Who knows? Birth registration in Indonesia is not good. We do not get the estimates from birth registrations. We have to get the estimates from indirect methods or from surveys. We carry out a survey, and like principally the Demographic and Health Survey in Indonesia, to get an estimate of the fertility rate. But my colleague Terry Hull has been fairly critical of the Demographic and Health Surveys in that they tend to miss single women who are not married, and women who are not married have lower births, of course, and so that affects the estimation of the fertility from the survey. Another method is to use the age distribution, so that from the censuses. So there's the population age 0 to 4 in the census, and they're people who were born in the last 5 years, and so you can make an estimate of the birth rate.
We still have a lot to do to make demographic bonus from illusion to reality. Ya, Pak. Next, please. Ini sama. Next, please. Conclusion. What we need is a new president who have long-term vision and keep the long-term population policy unchanged. Plus, keep Pak Dede to be the finance minister.
Thank you, Budi. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I almost forgot to give the time, but you managed to make it on time. I didn't thought that it was going to be very, very interesting. Mention about the political aspect. We don't have a next person in line is going to be Pak Budi Resosudarmo. We are going to have presentation. Discussion from Pak Budi. It's going to be 10 minutes. Oh, you have a slide. Yeah. It's okay to stand up so I can see that. Okay, cool.
Thank you for the opportunity. I prefer to stand up so that I can see the slide, because that is my note. Otherwise, I don't know what to talk. But first of all, I would like to mention an excuse if my comment is not that good. Chris Manning is supposed to give as a commentator of Peter McDonald paper, but he wasn't able to come due to his health issue. And Pierre van der Eng is supposed to substitute him, but then Pierre cannot come to Australia, to Indonesia, because his passport expired within the 6 months. So in the last 2 days, they asked me to do this. So I'm really the Banser of Banser. Or in football, in soccer, cadangan and cadangan. So here what you get from cadangan and cadangan. But I do ask Chris to guide me on what issue I need to focus, so this comment will be collaboration between me and Chris. So lesson learned in general that we both, me and Chris, got from Professor McDonald paper is that it is a fine survey. The paper is a fine survey of comparative population dynamic in an issue in which data, trend, and their implication are much debated, particularly because a lot of uncertainty in terms of the data and information that come up from the data. And among others, this uncertainty comes because we didn't really have a proper census in the last 2 census. And the conclusion that we get is that the decade of 2000 seemed quite different in terms of development trend of population growth comparing to the situation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In a way, Indonesia has left behind other countries in Asia in the issue of mortality, fertility in this last decade. Rate of decline in population growth has slowed in Indonesia, while in some other countries they don't. And in contrast to what has been viewed as a remarkable decline of fertility during the Suharto period, which underpinned a significant slowing of population growth, this is not happening in the last 10 years. And policy implications that we learned from this paper are this one in terms of data and information. This paper has been stressed the need for a more consistent and professional approach to collecting data and then to interpret this data collection. And we mentioned particularly in the case of mortality data, but also on fertility. And we have an impression that the paper suggests a more proactive population control policy to assist families in lowering their birth rate. However, policy should taking into account that too rapid fertility decline on the age could, basically we should a little bit when we trying to lower down the population growth, we need to take into account the ratio between ages, so then we still have enough people in the working age. And now, but we do have several comments about this paper. One is the issue, the relationship between schooling of women and fertility decline. Various research has shown that schooling enrollment has been increased in Indonesia. The Indonesia Project has a book last year showing those things, and this level of increase has been happening as well in 2000s decades, not only in the 80s or 90s, but also happening today. Even in the period which is in 2000, GDP is growing but less quickly as before, as well as the poverty decline, but not as quickly as before. Now, there are people that argue that in the 80s and 90s, this school enrollment, increase in school rate enrollment has been a factor in reducing fertility rate during 80s and 90s. But why this link seems to be gone in 2000s? You know, what happened? Although we still have this increase in school enrollment, but the link between school enrollment and fertility decline seem to be gone in that decade. The second issue that we would like Prof. McDonald to look deeper is on the issue of decentralization. Professor McDonald suggests that decentralization might be related to less intensive effort to support family planning program at district level. But what is exactly happening? You know, is this an issue related to funding, less availability of funding? Is this a coordination issue? Or it is because less aspiration these days about this issue, which is controlling population growth? And is this also because of leadership issue? Or it is the socio-economic structure has actually driven this problem, or others, you know? And probably Professor McDonald should actually take a bit more on this issue, so then we understand why this family planning program at district level has been basically less effective. Now, the other thing that we feel also missing in this paper is the link between changing structure of the Indonesian economy and the population, the situation of the population structure and growth in Indonesia. Have this changed? You know, because the Indonesian economy has been changed quite a bit, quite a lot actually, depending on, you know, what you believe, comparing to the 80s and 90s. So has this change actually affected demographic trend in the country? Or on the other hand, that this change has been a consequence of demographic trend? So, you know, basically, we would like to know what are actually the relationship. You know, what we don't really feel and we don't really get it is that the population growth trend can go wherever they want, despite of the economy. You know, the economic structural change, particularly not the economic growth. He mentioned economic growth, but on the structure of the economy. So that link seems to be missing, and as an economist, we believe that those links should be there. And the other thing is that is this really only a policy issue, or we do need to dig up a little bit more on the economic of having children? So it seemed to us that Professor McDonald stressed the emphasis on, you know, the emphasis that this is an issue of family planning program. But should we actually look from the household perspective, what has been happening in the household? You know, what kind of factor that has been changing the decision within household to having more children? Both are probably important, but we would like to have more discussion in both sides. Thank you. And the other thing is on the other Asian issue, Professor McDonald noted more sustained fertility decline in several Asian countries, particularly Thailand, Malaysia, and Myanmar. But what are the factors that happening over there and not happening in Indonesia that cause these things has been different? And even Philippines, who still have a higher growth rate, but the decline is relatively consistent, and Philippines also experience the same decentralization issue as Indonesia. Now there are an issue on demographic dividend that Chris and I would like to talk. We are not that sure that, you know, the strategy is that basically we're slowing down demographic, but not too slow. But however, considering the low quality of schooling in Indonesia, we just wonder whether the easier strategy is just slowing down as fast as possible and then improving the school quality. With less people, you can concentrate to improving the education quality. So then, although you have fewer labor supply but a better quality. Remember that many of the Asian countries currently also was facing middle income trap, and so this strategy probably will be more effective to handle those issues. The other thing also, the Ministry of Finance mentioned that Indonesia basically very difficult to grow, about 7%. The main reason is that while Indonesia grows about 7%, current account deficit becoming too big, and so it creates worry among the financial market people. And it's better that Indonesia controlling current account deficit, which is basically controlling the growth rate about 5 to 7%. And so to make faster improving in welfare, the best strategy is actually reducing the population as soon as possible. So that's one argument that we would like to put, rather than a bit too complicated strategy, which is be lowering them but not so low. This is probably an alternative, that's something to think about. The other things, this is a graph produced by Chris Manning showing basically the growth of labor supply within region Indonesia. Is that you can see that actually the one that have higher education is actually growing in all regions. So what we are trying to argue is that in the paper, Professor McDonald has mentioning that the problem of finding job for educated people in the periphery of Indonesia, but looking to those data, it doesn't seem to be the case. Basically, those people with tertiary education are being able to get a job outside Java, and also they are actually being able to migrate easily within region in Indonesia. So there are our points, and hopefully it is useful for all of you to think about the paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Budi, for the comments for the Peter McDonald's paper. Before I give the audience a chance to ask questions to these three panelists, I will give a 5 minutes chance for Peter McDonald to respond to the comments given by Pak Budi and Ibu Tuding. Please, Pak.
Okay, thank you very much to the discussants for their comments. I guess the main point that I wanted to make is Budi and Chris were talking about, well, given economic advance, changes in economic structure, given increases in education, wouldn't you expect fertility to keep falling? Because that's the theory, but it appears not to have done so. I don't have the confidence about the Indonesian numbers. So I would not at this point conclude that fertility did stop falling in Indonesia. As I mentioned earlier on, I have a suspicion that maybe in the past we mismeasured fertility, that the fertility over time was actually higher. And maybe we're measuring it a bit better now. Dr. Utomo and I have been doing study of young people in Jakarta, very intensive study. And certainly all of those relationships exist in Jakarta, in our survey in Jakarta. So that if you're educated, you have fewer children. If your economic situation is better, you're having fewer children. Fertility has been falling across time. So when we measure it ourselves in some detail, we get results that are completely consistent with the usual theoretical kind of picture. But I remain a bit skeptical about the conclusions that were made by Pak Budi there about the fertility has stopped falling. and no longer bears any relationship to what it should bear a relationship to. But I will be working on this myself into the future, and perhaps I'll come up with a better picture. So that applies to most of what was said. I think the main point that I wanted to make, and this applies to what Butuning said as well, in referring to the demographic bonus as an illusion, what I meant was that, well, it's there, but it's been there for a long time already, and it's going to be there for a long time in the future. You do not rely solely on a demographic structure. It's not going to produce the result that you want. That's what I meant when I said illusion. You do have to, as we all have all been saying, including Butuning, you have to focus much more on the other components of that little formula I gave. There's the population structure one. There are 3 components, population structure, but that's there and it's looking okay for quite a while. But the other 2 components, the labour force participation, the employment levels, focus on that, and also on the output per worker, on the productivity. And in that formula, the participation and the output per worker, particularly the output per worker, have a much bigger impact on the final result than do the other components. So the population component actually doesn't have such a big impact compared to output per worker. And so that's why I'm saying, don't let's think that just because we've got a demographic bonus, things are going to be great. The key issue is all kinds of social and economic policy, including education policy that Budi was talking about. The focus, the real focus is there, not on the population policy. And I actually don't agree with the notion that the problem with education in Indonesia is the numbers. I think the problem with education in Indonesia is the policy. is the way we do education. It's not, if we had lower numbers, at the moment, the teacher-pupil ratios in Indonesia are very, very low compared to a lot of other countries. So there's lots of teachers, maybe their quality's not so great. So it's not about the number of pupils, it's about the organisation and the quality of the education that is actually provided. And as I said, if you put the pressure on the birth rate, you'll hammer it down, and you'll hammer it down to a place you don't want to be, as has been experienced by other countries. I agree that we need to keep bringing birth rate down, as Tuning said, but relatively slowly. It's not a panic situation, and I believe that once we get a good analysis, we get some good data. And data is usually problematic. It will actually confirm that fertility falls with education and falls with economic development, counter to what some of the impressions that are being presented in Indonesia at the present time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter McDonald. Now, I would like to give a chance for the audience to ask a question and comments. So we're going to have several each. So the first one, I would give like 3 persons to ask comment and suggestions. Please raise your hand. Okay. 1, 2, and 3. And please state your name and the affiliation and the question that you're going to ask. Maybe like the persons. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Fitri from Bapnas. I would like to address this question to all of the panelists here. So, I've been I have heard about bonus demographic dividend from 2001, if I'm not mistaken, from the study between Bappenas and LDFEUI. So what I would like to know now, based on your professional experience, and also given assumption that our economic growth will be the same like the past 10 years, how likely is it for Indonesia to achieve this demographic dividend? Is it achievable?
The system is quite high, so certainly I agree with that. This was the subject of Peter Gardner's thesis many years ago. Education quality rock bottom. Yeah, I think that's a strong statement. You know, I've been around Indonesia for a long time, and the quality of young Indonesians today, in my view, is massively higher than it used to be. You know, there's a lot of very impressive young Indonesians today, and I think, you know, so long as they're able to take advantage of their skills and their quality, I think, you know, I have a more optimistic view of Indonesia's future in that regard. And so, yeah, but of course, as I mentioned, we can still do lots about education policy, and as I said, the problem is not the numbers of children; it's the way we do education, and that needs to be improved. Jeff, projections based on bad data, yeah, well, they are, and that is worrying. But the key question about why wouldn't Indonesia follow Thailand? My present view is that it won't, and I've expressed that view recently also in respect of Iran, where there was a big concern on the part of the government that the fertility was going to fall to a very low level, and they needed to do something about it, and they started to invent policies in Iran which were not very desirable, you know, encouraging marriage of teenagers, discriminating against women in employment, etc. So, and I went on mission to Iran late last year with two of my Iranian colleagues to try and overthrow a bill that was before the parliament, and it's still before the parliament, so far we've been successful in slowing it down. Why? And one of the central arguments we gave was that we didn't think Iran's fertility was going to fall down to these very low levels. And I feel that about Indonesia too at this point in time. One of the reasons is the age of marriage. The countries that have very, very low fertility are all countries which have quite late marriage. Indonesia's age of marriage is still relatively young. And while it stays relatively young, not too young, but relatively young, I don't think you're going to see fertility hit a very low level. But I do agree about you know, child-friendly societies and so on that we need, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, that in order to prevent fertility falling to very low levels, we do need to have child-friendly societies and societies that are friendly to women mothers who are working. And Indonesia needs to, you know, have a bit of a view to that future. Finally, from Matthew, migration. Well, as I mentioned in the talk, you know, Singapore has taken the view that you have said. Singapore brought down fertility very rapidly from a very high level, but it kept going down to low levels, 1.2, 1.3 births per woman. They spent a long time and a lot of policies to try to reverse that, but they were pretty unsuccessful. It's still very low. And it's the case that Chinese populations around the world, actually, even Chinese in Australia, have low fertility. And so there is a bit of a cultural element in it as well, I think. And so Singapore has said, okay, well, let's forget about that, and we'll bring in a lot of migrants. And that's their policy approach. it works for Singapore because Singapore is a small country. And you can bring in a lot of migrants for Singapore, but it's not a lot of migrants. And this approach works for Australia too, because Australia is still a relatively small population. But if you want to bring in migrants to make up for deficits in births for countries like Japan or Indonesia, we're talking about huge, absolutely huge numbers of migrants, which is just won't happen. And there's cultural issues. You know, I mean, it's easy for a country like Australia, which is a migrant country. It has a migrant culture, etc. It's easy for us to absorb migrants, but it's not. You know, if you look at Japan, Japan is very anti-migration, despite the fact that it has this very low fertility rate, and it's anti-migration for cultural reasons. And you know, I don't. Indonesians potentially excess labour supply going off to other countries. Well, it's happening to some extent now, and that may well be the case in the future. But as you know, countries that are trying to attract migrants these days are generally trying to attract high-skilled migrants. And that's a bit of a worry for Indonesia. As I mentioned before, there are to my mind, a lot of very intelligent, bright, young Indonesians today. You don't want to lose them. There are countries out there which are falling over themselves to get skilled migrants, like Australia, it's something that Indonesia has to be a little bit wary of. If I put on I advise the Minister for Immigration in Australia. If I put on my Australian migration hat, we'll take all the young Indonesians you want to send us.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, we already 15 minutes past our schedule, so we don't have any more question and answer session. So before we close, I would ask if these panelists have something to say. Good tuning, probably.
Just a few words. We know that we have a lot of homework to do. Although we are facing in the next decade a long way to go, but we have to do it now, if not yesterday. Thank you.
Okay, it's been a great day and it's been a great discussion, and I hope it gives you a new information lesson. Yeah, for me myself, I'm not a demographer. I learn a lot, so I expect that you do experience the same thing too. So with that words, I would express a sincere gratitude. Thank you for all for coming, for attending and participating in lively discussion. And see you in the next Sadli lectures. Course is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald, Professor King, and Mr. Budi Resosudarmo.